Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing this evening? Good, right? Saturday night under the wings of Air Force One. What better way to spend an evening? My name is Tony Penny, and I am the Chief Learning Officer here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And it is a tradition at this institution that we begin each program with the Pledge of Allegiance. So I ask you to please rise and join me with the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Please be seated. So before we get started with our national championship this evening, I want to take a moment to thank the many people who have made tonight's event possible. As you may know, tonight's events are the culmination of a series of competitions that have taken place across the country over the course of the year. And in particular, I want to take a minute to thank our regional partners who are with us this evening, including Ms. Kirsten Nash from our Greater Texas competition. Is Kirsten here? There she is. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, we can give her a hand. Chris Adams from Truman High School in Independence. Thank you very much. There's no rivalry between Truman and Reagan here. And our Northeast host, Brother John McGrory from New York. Brother John. Thank you very much. I also want to thank a couple of our partners who are not with us this evening, Miss Christina Tolugan of Los Angeles and Charles Donovan from the Mid-Atlantic region in Towson, Maryland. So thank them as well. In addition to our regional partners, I want to extend a special thanks to Dino Pope, who's the membership manager for the National Speech and Debate Association, the head debate coach at Simpson College. He has been running our tab room, meaning all the results are coming in, and he's the one who's been processing it and make our competition go. So thank you very much, Dino, for all that today. As in years past, we held an online competition open to students from across the country. And we also partnered with the National Speech and Debate Association, as well as the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues, to bring together today 16 of the most talented young communicators in the United States. So we want to say thank you to all our fantastic partners, of course to these spectacular students, their parents, their coaches, and everyone who has supported them today, but also all through the season and leading up to this day as well. In addition, we want to thank the Winsong Trust, whose financial support of this program makes it all possible. And if I can, just for 1 second, I really also want to thank our team here at the Reagan Foundation. They work so hard to make sure that this event is a wonderful experience for our competitors. They fly all over the country and make this happen. They give up nights and weekends because they really do care about helping cultivate that next generation of citizens and leaders. So thanks to our staff for all you've done to make this such a wonderful day as well. Now, effective communication has always been a hallmark of democracy. So whether the printing presses of the Revolution, the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, Roosevelt's fireside chats during World War II, the televised State of the Union addresses, or even President Reagan's famous call to tear down this wall, now we are in a time where the power of communication continues to grow. The speed of communication is faster than ever, and the ability for a single person to share his or her ideas across the entire planet has never been greater. Using a device that is roughly the size of a candy bar, we can connect, share, and spread ideas like never before in the history of the world. With this speed and with this reach comes something else: power. The power to influence, the power to share, the power to engage others in a cause. To borrow from President Abraham Lincoln, who once said, quote, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power." Well, tonight, we embrace this test, and we celebrate the power of student voice. Here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, this is our mission: to develop proactive, educated, and conscientious citizen leaders to help develop the very sorts of informed and responsible students and citizens you'll hear from in just a few minutes. The sorts of students who are well-versed in what it means to exercise the power of we the people. In 1988, President Reagan said, "Since the founding of this nation, education and democracy have gone hand in hand." Thomas Jefferson not only wrote the Declaration of Independence and served as one of our most distinguished presidents, but he founded one of the great higher institutions in the country, the University of Virginia. Jefferson and the founders believed that a nation that governs itself, like ours, must rely on an informed and engaged electorate. When it comes to preparing students for the responsibilities of citizenship, I can't think of a better academic or extracurricular program than speech and debate. Some of the most educated, thoughtful, and articulate people I've met in my time here at the Foundation have been teenagers that just so happen to be involved in speech and debate. President Reagan was well known for his optimism, and from what I've seen from our competitors these past few days in conversations over meals and in the competitions that's taken place, I too am really optimistic because in a very short time, you're going to be the leaders who are taking our country in all sorts of really powerful directions. So throughout our day today, our 16 finalists have been competing all across the museum, but now we're down to the final two. The stakes are high. This is why we're under Air Force One. The winner of tonight's championship round is going to receive a $10,000 college scholarship. And if you've seen what college costs these days, that's no chump change. For those of you who may not be familiar with the format of academic debate, I want to point out a few differences from the debates you may have seen on television. So first, we're only going to have one topic. We're not going to bounce around to everything from foreign policy to economic policy. We have one topic this evening, and that's this. Resolved. On balance, the freedoms guaranteed to the press benefit American democracy. As opposed to the politicians on TV who vigorously debate their deeply held beliefs and echo statements from the campaign trail, right now, our two finalists don't even know which side of this argument they're going to be taking. Right? It's pretty tough. How many of you? Just imagine yourself sitting in front of hundreds of people. You're about to go up on stage under Air Force One in a place where presidential candidates have debated. You're not even sure what side you're going to take. That's the challenge before our two competitors here in just a minute. As we said, there's a lot of scholarship money on the line. So in just a second, we're actually going to flip a coin to determine which side they're going to take. And so audience, you're going to play an important role tonight too. And I want to ask you, whether you're one of our 4 final round judges or one of our audience members, or just a member of the audience who's here to listen, to try and determine the winner of this debate from your seat in the audience, what I don't want you to do is I don't want you to come into this with your idea about who's the winner preconceived. That's not what we're about. We're not about here, powerful communication is not about reaffirming your beliefs that you already hold, especially in this type of competition. What it's about, you want to listen to the two students who are about to take the stage, and you want to see which one of them is communicating better, which one resonates. So listen to their arguments, listen to the cases they make, and at the end, decide which one you think has made the better case, which one has been a greater communicator. With that said, on your seat, each of you should have received a judging guide, which has the timing of the debate on the back page. On the inside, you'll find explanations of what to be looking for during each area of the debate. Those of us who work on a daily basis in the house the Great Communicator built know that there is a beauty, a resonance, and a power in effective communication, and that's what we're asking you to look for in tonight's competitors. So you may be wondering why I'm explaining this to you, and it's because you too are going to play a part in selecting our next great communicator. As the great communicator himself was able to sway crowds of thousands in a country of millions in a world of billions, the winner of tonight's debate should be able to sway all of you through the power of his communication. You're going to get a chance to vote using your smartphone. So stay tuned after the final round for instructions on just how to do this. So before I introduce you to our two finalists, I want to introduce you to our fantastic panel of final round judges. We are extremely privileged to have with us tonight, first, an undergraduate at Harvard University who is pursuing a joint degree in philosophy and government. She has been involved in debate since 2011, competing primarily in congressional debate for Southlake Carroll High, where she graduated in 2017. She now spends most of her time managing corporate relations for one of the largest conferences in Asia and is implementing programming for the Campus Women's Center. Please join me in welcoming Emma Lynn. Our next judge is Mr. Jack Tuckness. Jack has been a debate coach for 35 years. He's a 7-diamond coach who's been inducted into the National Speech and Debate Association's Hall of Fame. He has coached over 200 students to the National Speech and Debate Association National Tournament and 5 students to this competition. His debate squad at Central High School in Springfield, Missouri, is the nation's 2nd largest chapter. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jack Tuckness. Our next judge has an insider's perspective on what it means to be the great communicator. She joined the Reagan-Bush re-election campaign in 1984 and was recruited to work in the White House Office of Presidential Advance. She was in Berlin to hear President Reagan ask Secretary Gorbachev to tear down this wall. She was President Reagan's former chief of staff and is the current chief administrative officer of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, although sometimes she says her job is the chief of chaos. Please join me in welcoming Miss Joanne Drake. Finally, our head judge this evening is pretty remarkable. He is the CEO of procon.org, which is America's leading nonpartisan source of pro and con research on important policy issues. His website serves more than 25 million readers each year, including schools in all 50 states and 90 countries. Kami has spent decades leveraging technology to make education accessible and affordable for millions of people. His work has been published in textbooks, magazines, newspapers, and websites across the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kami Akavan. And now, I'm going to introduce our finalists to the stage. Our first finalist is a graduate of Chaminade High School in Long Island, New York. Mr. John Michael McGlure will attend Northwestern University in the fall, planning to major in economics and philosophy. And a fun fact about him is that he plays the trombone. So come on up to the stage. Finalist number 2. This student is a recent graduate of the Dalton School in New York City. Michael Gormley will be attending the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown this fall and studying global business. Michael also ran the New York Marathon last year, so he will probably get to the stage a little bit faster than I would. So, Michael, please come up and join us. At this time, I'm going to ask Kami Akavan to flip the coin, and I'm going to ask John to call it. So we will determine what sides we are on.
Tails.
Tails. He's calling tails. Kami? Oh. It is tails. So it is tails.
I'll affirm.
Go with the affirm. We will have the neg, or the negative here. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, your 2018 National Championship of the Great Communicator Debate will begin.
Is everybody ready? In 1786, Thomas Jefferson famously wrote, "Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost." Because revoking the freedoms granted to the press would be destructive to the foundational principles laid out in both the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, I affirm the resolution. On balance, the freedoms guaranteed to the press benefit American democracy. My first point is that restricting the press paves the way for tyranny. We can learn much about the importance of the free press by examining countries that heavily restrict the ability of journalists to report freely. In Russia, a restricted press was the single largest contributing factor in Vladimir Putin's rise to power. Michael Ray, a freelance journalist, notes that when Putin was chosen to become prime minister, Kremlin operatives created a propaganda machine and called it Project Putin. Former Washington Post Moscow correspondents Peter Baker and Susan Glasser explained that Project Putin allowed the oligarchs and operatives to virtually invent Putin, using their command over state television to concoct his image and tear down rivals. In fact, the Courier Mail reports that on Russia television networks, Putin was portrayed as a James Bond-like hero, flying in warplanes, scuba diving, and riding shirtless on a horse. The results of this propaganda campaign were astonishing, as Michael Ray reports that Project Putin successfully raised Putin's approval rating from just 33% to over 80%. Worse, when Putin consolidated his political panel, he dismantled NTV, the sole independent television channel in Russia at the time. More recently, the media crackdown in Turkey has had chilling effects. The Boston Globe reports that in Turkey, about 160 journalists are currently in jail, and more than 150 media outlets, including broadcasters, newspapers, and magazines, have been shut down. The story of Severi Guven, the former editor-in-chief of a political news magazine in Turkey, speaks volumes about the horror that ensues from a restricted press. Mr. Guven published a satirical cover in his magazine, and as a result, he was sentenced to more than 2 decades in prison. He was forced to flee his home country with his family and seek asylum in Greece. He has since observed that the strictures placed on the free press in Turkey demonstrate that President Erdogan is obviously on a path towards tyranny. Just imagine for a moment living in an America where simply making a joke about a political leader would have you sent to prison. I'm confident that I speak for all of us when I say that's not a country that we want to live in. Simply, the fact that tyrants like Erdogan and Putin restrict the press should tell us all that we need to know. Dictators have recognized that a restricted press is key to maintaining their power, and we too must recognize that a free press is key to we the people maintaining power. My second point is that a free press informs the public of governmental corruption. Unfortunately, we cannot rely on our politicians to keep us informed. The sad reality is that some politicians are more concerned with re-election than upholding and defending the Constitution. In 2015, Ted Cruz said on the floor of the Senate that there is no greater incentive in this body than getting reelected. Senator Cruz's statement is evidenced in American history. Despite the fact that President Nixon was on track to win re-election in 1972, the Committee to Re-elect the President, commonly known as the CRP, hired the so-called plumbers to break into the offices of the DNC in the Watergate Hotel to bug their phones. After their arrest, it was only through the untiring work of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein that we came to understand the connection between the CRP and the Watergate burglars. Sarah James, an award-winning press correspondent, notes that a free press allowed reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein at the Washington Post to dig into Watergate. In bringing misdeeds and crimes to light, these journalists safeguarded and revitalized our democratic process. Without freedom of the press, the Nixon administration certainly would have used its power to silence Woodward and Bernstein. From exposing the whiskey ring and the Teapot Dome scandal, to publishing the Pentagon Papers, to uncovering Watergate and the NSA's domestic spying, the press has proven itself absolutely indispensable in ensuring that we, the American people, can clearly see what is going on in our government. It's scary to think that in an America without a free press, we would have no idea if our politicians were telling the truth. As Thomas Jefferson noted, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and what never will be. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? Perfect. Today's debate is a question of whether or not the freedoms guaranteed to the press are helping or hurting our democracy. I agree with my opponent that a healthy press is vital for democracy, but that's not what we have. Our press is sick, and with it, our democracy as well. The foundation of freedom that our founding fathers laid is now rotting, and it is time for us to recognize that bold steps are required once again to make sure our freedom lives on in the future. Everyone in this room has heard the phrase fake news more times than they can count. But what exactly has the term come to mean in the minds of Americans? This year, the Knight Foundation surveyed Americans about the meaning of fake news. The results are astonishing. 80% of Americans said that they consider stories which cast politicians or political groups in a bad light to be fake news. Let that sink in for a moment. There's so much false criticism in the media that a vast majority of Americans believe that any article containing political criticism is a lie. My opponent would like you to think that our current press is the holy grail of political accountability, but the people don't see it that way. Just think about how many headlines or news stories you've seen which claim that there was some new scandal which would destroy a certain political candidate. Articles have promised to blow the truth wide open about emails or tax returns, and then delivered nothing. The press has used its freedom to destroy its credibility. The foundation of freedom that our founding fathers laid is rotting before our eyes, and there are two uniquely American press freedoms which are causing this decay. The first is the increase in media conglomerates and centralized control over news media. The large mergers between Disney and Fox and other media companies are excellent examples of this, but I'd like to talk about a slightly lesser-known company called the Sinclair Broadcast Group. Sinclair is the largest owner of local news networks in the country, and what they've done over the past few years is require all of those stations to run stories with a strong political bias, oftentimes citing false information or criticizing other media networks. This may not seem significant, but over 100 million Americans still get their news from local television. And Sinclair is a perfect example of how press freedoms are being abused and exploited to the detriment of our truth and our democracy. Across the board, we're seeing political agendas color news coverage. And as the large media companies continue to grow, their influence and bias only stands to increase. The second uniquely American issue is the lack of restrictions on the press's role in elections. When we think of the freedoms of the press, we often think of information that is published by news outlets, a newspaper, or a story that's being run on television. But a byproduct of America's press freedoms is also that corporations and wealthy private citizens can spend as much as they want to use the press to produce TV segments, books, or movies which are designed to influence the election. And if that wasn't bad enough, the press also has the freedom to sell political advertisements to politicians, super PACs, corporations, and other special interest groups. These freedoms dramatically increase the influence of corporations or individuals with far too much money on their hands. And these press freedoms have made money vital for political success, giving a small percentage of the population significant control over election outcomes and the policies passed. The same freedoms, which once acted as a check on the government, are now being used by those in power to suppress our democracy. These same press freedoms are used to confuse the general public, to sensationalize controversy and dilute our values, to misinform rather than to inform. Lost in the discussions about the threat that fake news poses is the fact that behind every false story is someone writing it, and behind every viral lie is a social media platform propagating it. The freedoms guaranteed to the press enable these individuals to absolve themselves of responsibility. And the freedoms of the press are now working against their intended purpose. Politicians remain insulated from power and scandal, and special interest groups push out news, movies, and advertisements to try and shape the views of the voting public. Fixing this broken system is the next step in the evolution of the freedom that our founding fathers wanted for us. In today's debate, you have a choice between two ideologies. My opponent is scared of change and is looking to the past to justify why we should leave things as they are. I'm saying we must be brave and take a step forward and chart a path into a better future. Thank you.
I have 2 minutes. I'll start that. Is everybody ready? First, we need to make an important clarification. There is a difference between a right itself and the current application and implementation of that right. Here's an example. If a person is sick and they have a disease, that doesn't make that person fundamentally bad. That means something has overtaken that person that needs to be solved. But that disease does not fundamentally destroy that person. Similarly, just because the press in the status quo has not been fulfilling its responsibility does not mean freedom of the press has not been beneficial to American democracy. So let's take a step back for a moment. Every instance that my opponent brought up in his last speech was about the current press, how the current press is not fulfilling its obligations. But we have to look at history as well. And as we've seen in the past, the press has exposed several governmental scandals, and it has opened the eyes of the American people. And just because right now the press isn't doing exactly what it should be doing does not mean we should get rid of the freedom that has allowed it to be so successful in the past. Instead, we should work on solving the underlying problems that are causing issues in the press. And so my opponent brings up this idea of the dissemination of fake information. And the reality is, there's a more fundamental problem here. Why are people spreading fake information? Why are people not telling the truth? That's the problem we need to solve. We need to create a better political environment whereby people can talk about ideas, not talk over each other. This is not a problem with the press. This is a problem with our current political climate. And so to say restricting the press is going to solve all of our political problems is simply untrue. But then my opponent says the press has used its freedom to destroy its credibility. And while it's true that there are several biased news organizations, there really are attempts by certain journalists to be objective. Yes, everybody has biases, but there are journalists who give an honest attempt at telling the truth. And if you turn on the television and you look at what's being reported, what we actually see is that the press is still acting as an important check on our government. Whether or not you agree with President Trump and his policies, it is still good to have an organization that can check him and that can talk about his policies. And if you watch the media, you see that that's what's happening. You may not agree with the media, but that's what's so great about America. We don't have to agree with those we disagree with, but we should let them speak. We should let them have a voice. And that is what the press does on a large scale. It ensures that we, the American people, are informed. My opponent says that large mergers of media companies create this situation whereby we only get one viewpoint. But this is simply untrue. Again, if you look on television and you flip through channels, you can get several different perspectives. Additionally, you can get even more perspectives on social media. There are several ways in which we can get different types of information from different perspectives. Then my opponent says that a lack of restriction on the press has led to an advantage in elections for the rich. Well, let's look at a recent example in the New York primary. Joe Crowley, who is a very powerful incumbent in New York State, was recently defeated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had far less money and far less campaigning power than Mr. Crowley, and she was able to defeat him without the same press coverage that he received. This just goes to show you that the press does not have an indispensable role in determining elections. Finally, my opponent says that press freedoms are being misused to misinform the American public. And even if you believe this is true, that is not a reason to do away with the right itself. Just because there are current problems with the implementation of this right does not make the right itself bad. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? Perfect. If all my opponent had to do in today's round was prove that authoritarianism and the government cracking down on the freedoms of the press absolutely was bad, then there wouldn't be much of a debate to be had here. I think we can all agree that we would rather live in the United States than in Russia or Cuba or any of the countries that my opponent cited. What's important to recognize is the question in today's round is whether or not the current press freedoms that we have and the current system that we have is working for us and benefiting democracy or harming democracy. So my opponent may say that the sickness will pass, and he agrees that there's problems right now, but hopefully one day the person and the sickness will be solved by maintaining things as they are in the status quo. But what I believe is that the situation today is so fundamentally different from what it has been in the past. The internet has made it so that access to the media is so much broader. The entire political landscape is entirely different from all of the examples that my opponent cited. And that's why it's so important that we don't look to the past, but we look to blaze a new path towards the future. Because what we're going to be seeing is that the sickness that my opponent and I both agree has descended over our democracy is not because of every freedom of the press, but is because of two specific freedoms of the press, which I mentioned in my argument. Now, my opponent says that in his world, there's better political engagement because there's more information being provided to the people. But I ask you to ask yourself, by and large, as media conglomerates are increasing in size and corporate and individual influence is shifting the titles and the bias in news coverage more and more, is the information that we're seeing in the media what the fact trying to being as objective as possible, or is it being more and more colored with bias? Is the information that we're being given what we should see or what other people want us to see? And I believe that the increase in corporate and individual control in the media has made it so that the information we're reading is not the information we should be getting, but the information that a select few people want us to be getting. And the idea of corporate control or conglomeration of media is not one that says because one company will buy up all others, there will only be one perspective. The argument is that when you have fewer players and fewer companies who own and you have more conglomerates, there's going to be more bias in play. So instead of having more neutral sites, you'll have 5 or 4 giant corporations who are all trying to push forward their own agenda, leaving the neutral American who's trying to decide and decipher information lost and with no source to turn. What's really important here is the second response that he makes to the idea of trying to get money out of politics is that money isn't the only thing that influences election outcomes. And the example that he cites is the New York Senate primary with Ocasio-Cortez. But there are two really important things to remember. The first is that since it was a Democratic primary and he was an incumbent, her opponent did not spend a particularly large amount of money because he thought that he was going to win. And then secondly, this is the exception and not the rule. If we look by and large to the role that money is playing in politics across the country, we see an incredibly disturbing trend. And the important thing to recognize here is that the reason why money is playing more of a role in the media and why bias is increasing and polarization is increasing is because we're consolidating power. We're consolidating power of our democracy and of our press into the hands of a select few individuals. Now, judges in the audience, I ask you to think to what the fundamental purpose of the freedoms of the press were. It was to make sure that power could not be consolidated into the hands of one or two individuals. It was supposed to check the government. It was supposed to make sure that our democracy worked for the people, that you and I have an equal say in everything that's going on in our government. And what we're seeing today is that the freedoms of the press are making it so that those individuals and specific individuals and special interest groups have the most say in our government and have the most say in policy and are increasing polarization. It is time that we alleviate the sickness that our democracy has and we take back our democracy and give it to the people that our founding fathers intended, where our founding fathers intended for it to be. Thank you.
Is everybody ready? So you talk a lot about, in your case, about how the press has used its freedom to destroy its credibility, and how all of these media conglomerates are leading to more bias. But how do media conglomerations necessarily mean there are bias? For example, can't there be a media conglomeration that actually promotes moderate points of view? Why does a conglomeration necessarily mean that there's going to be more bias?
In the same way that there could hypothetically be an authoritarian government in which the press has a lot of freedoms and the government doesn't have any scandals, there could hypothetically be a world in which special interest groups or very wealthy individuals are trying to buy up media companies simply for the sake of propagating true information. But what we're seeing in the status quo is that that is not true, and that the people and the conglomerates have a specific political agenda that they are pushing forward. And so as much as I would like to hope that maybe that would be possible, because it's not, we have to act and try and restrict it and prevent it from happening. Is it okay if I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you talk a lot about this idea of making sure that there's solving back for the root causes, making sure that there's better political engagement.
Sure.
Do you think that if individuals see news coverage and press coverage which has less bias, that they will be more engaged or less engaged in our democracy?
I would say they would be more engaged by having objective information and being able to make decisions based on data, based on the truth. Of course people will be more engaged because they'll be able to take action based on what's actually true. What I think the issue is essentially that without any type of press, there is no information at all. Even if people are receiving biased information from their current news sources, there is still information behind that bias. You see, people confuse bias with misinformation. Just because something is biased doesn't make it untrue. There's underlying information which is presented with a bias. So yes, people are getting information with biases. But as long as we recognize that these sources have biases, for example, most people know that certain news outlets have certain biases, then we can still decipher between what is opinion and what is actual factual information. Can I ask you another question?
Of course.
So you have said that a lack of restriction on the press has led to certain outcomes in elections, and it's led to more privileged candidates being able to get into office. How would you explain the fact that grassroots movements over the past few years have continued to increase?
So there's a couple of important things here. Is that on the one hand, while we are seeing grassroots movements increase in recent years, we're not necessarily seeing that same thing correlate in our actual, in terms of who's being elected, right? So let's take a look at Bernie Sanders. He had, by and large, the most number of donations out of any candidate in terms of on an individual basis. He had huge grassroots campaigns. And there were so many people who were trying to mobilize and get out more people to vote for Bernie Sanders. And at the end of the day, he didn't win the nomination. And the reason why, and the reason why a lot of people think that this happened, was because of the control of corporations and special interest groups and big money donors over politics. And it's less about privileged candidates who sort of have of their own wealth, who are able to win elections, and more about preventing special interest groups from influencing candidates and using their money to curry political favor and influence the outcomes of the policies which are being passed.
Well, I just note on that point that you talk specifically about these special interest groups within the DNC, but never actually connect that to how that's unique to the press.
So the press freedoms cover, on the one hand, the way we typically think about it is newspapers or media outlets publishing information. On the other hand, there's also a distinct amount of freedoms which are granted to individuals through the freedom of the press, which gives them the ability to push out news stories, to buy news outlets. These are they're just as similarly freedoms of the press granted to individuals. And so the problems and the way that it links back into the freedoms that we're talking about in today's debate has to do with the fact that these freedoms allow more money to be in politics. They allow more advertising to be purchased. They allow news corporations to report with a slant and with a bias. If news media outlets couldn't sell political attack ads and couldn't air them, or politicians couldn't spend money on these ads, then we wouldn't have the same types of problems that we're seeing now, and we wouldn't have the same influence that money has in our elections today. And I think it's time for moderator questions.
Hello. Is this on? Okay. So my first question is to John. In your last speech rebutting Michael, you talk about how we should prefer historical examples to his present-day examples. But if Michael can prove that the free press has fundamentally changed, why should we prefer, or that the free press has fundamentally changed and that the present and future role of the press will continue to subvert democracy? Why should we prefer your past historical examples over his conjectured future ones?
So the first thing I would argue is that the press has not fundamentally changed. Rather, I would say that the political environment has changed. And so that is severely different from the press changing, because if the political environment has changed, that means that the issue is with the political environment. And the reason I say we should look to historical examples is simple. Because there was less polarization in these times. More people believed the news. And insofar as that's true, it shows that there are political environments in which the free press has worked, and it has worked well. And so my argument is fundamentally that the failures of the press currently in the status quo are not a result of the press as an institution, but a result of our current political environment. And I think it's a rather sad prospect for our country if we believe that we can never recover from this poor political discourse and poor political environment. And so I have optimism that in the future, the press, when it exists within a circumstance where we have civil discourse, can act as it has in the past and be a truth teller.
And then my question to Michael, throughout your past two speeches, you've talked about how fewer players involved in the media results in more bias, and you talk about conglomeration. But by removing or restricting freedom of press, doesn't that result in even fewer players resulting in even more bias?
So the important distinction here is that what I'm advocating for is not the government cracking down on the press or shutting down news media sites or saying you can't publish this story or that story. What I am saying is that there are a few fundamental freedoms which have poisoned the press and poisoned our democracy, which if we address those, we can start to make sure that the underlying good things that the press can create and give us shine through. And so related to the question that you just asked my opponent, I, to a certain extent, would agree that there have been a lot of changes, right, with regards to the way that the press exists, and that in the past, there was less polarization. But we also have to acknowledge that in recent years, there have been landmark decisions which increase the freedoms of the press and of corporations, like Citizens United, which contributed to the problems that I'm talking about. And so we see a direct link between a past in which there was fewer polarization increased liberalizations and media freedoms in terms of enabling people and corporations to spend more money in politics, and now today, a world in which my opponent and I both agree, and I think the audience and all the judges can agree as well, that our democracy and our press is struggling and would appear to have an illness.
This question is really going to go to both of you. So, John, you can answer first and then either agree or define, if you would, the press. Because as you both have acknowledged with social media and when more and more people getting their news from social media, do you have some individual who sets up a blog and puts out stuff? Is that considered media? I mean, press, or are we talking about established organizations that you usually see on TV?
So I would say the press is any group that purports to be giving out information and has the ability to disseminate that information to a significant group of people. And this is why we have a distinction in the Constitution between freedom of speech and freedom of the press, because freedom of speech applies only to individuals, whereas I would say the press would be any group that can have a farther reach than individuals by themselves and actually purports to be giving out information objectively.
I would agree generally with that definition. I would also add that included in the freedoms of the press and included in the press are individuals who choose to publish certain kinds of information and disseminate that information. So it's not only groups or organizations, but if there are individuals with a significant reach or with the funds or money or power to get out a message and try and push a certain political message or push news onto the general public, that they would also be part of the press.
Okay, and another question that's really be to both of you, and we'll let you start this time.
Okay.
And then, John, you can follow up. What obligation does the press have to make sure that the stories they print are accurate, and what should be done if they are proven that they are not accurate? What responsibility does the press have?
So I think something that's incredibly important to note in what I've been saying this entire time is that I don't think that the press right now is fundamentally broken. I don't think that freedom of the press is a bad thing. But what I do think is that there are very specific things and influences which are acting on the press which have made it so that they're more likely to report false information, or they're more likely to mislead, or bias is playing a larger role in increasing polarization in our country. And I believe that if we get rid of these influences, if we sort of increase the restrictions on the role that money can play in politics and the role that money can play in controlling media narratives across the country, we can solve back for a lot of those problems that we're talking about in today's round.
Yeah. So I would certainly say that the media has a responsibility to verify the information that it's publishing, and to be as certain as possible that they are not publishing false information. Now, as to what we should do if they are caught publishing false information, so I think this is a fundamental difference between the two of us. I do not believe in governmental action to crack down on the press that publishes false information. What made President Reagan so great was that he trusted the American people. He believed in the intelligence and goodness of the American people. And similarly, my position is that when a news organization habitually lies, is habitually dishonest, the American people will punish them. The American people will no longer trust them. And we've actually seen this happen in the status quo. Sources that have become extremely biased are no longer trusted by the American public in general. And so I would say when a news source is habitually involved in publishing inaccurate information, the American people will no longer trust them. And that's why I think this problem really ultimately solves itself. And why the problem right now is people misusing freedoms, not the freedoms themselves. And today's debate asks us, are the freedoms themselves good? Not the way they're used by certain individuals, but are the freedoms beneficial to American democracy? And I would certainly say yes, given the fact that news sources that act dishonestly are punished by the American people.
Thank you both. That was really incredible. I have a question for both of you, and we'll start over here from the first one. John, can you tell me, what do you think your opponent's strongest argument is?
So I think his strongest argument is that we are in a situation where the press is not acting as it was initially intended, and the press is not being an objective truth teller in every case. And so I definitely agree that this is a problem, and I think he rightly points out that this is not healthy. This is not right. We would much prefer to have a system where information is objectively being reported and people don't have to worry about information being inaccurate or not telling the whole truth. That being said, I do think the fundamental flaw here is it's not indicting the freedom of the press itself. Rather, it's indicting individuals who are misusing that freedom, or more specifically, misapplying that freedom. And so I think he has the correct premise, but I think what he says we should do about that premise is fundamentally flawed.
And you?
I believe that when you have a country with a history of, a country like America with such a great and rich history and sort of the pioneer of freedom and all of that legacy behind you, it can be it's very compelling. And what my opponent says is very compelling with regards to trying to maintain a system that has worked, that the underlying freedoms are important, and that preserving them is something that we should always prioritize. And I guess the way that I would respond to that is our founding fathers didn't maintain the status quo. And when they were trying to found our country and determine what it was that we needed to do in order to ensure liberty and justice for all, they took bold steps. And they changed the laws and they changed the way that the system worked because they wanted to do something new. And if there are issues, if we can all recognize that there are issues in the status quo with the way that our press is working for us, the situation and the climate has changed so much, and there has been an increase in the press freedoms in terms of the amount of money that individuals can spend. And I guess what I ask to you is, what is it that is so, I can understand being resistant to change, but what is it that is so bad about making sure that we have a system which works for us, and we have a democracy which isn't more controlled by special interest groups and wealthy individuals than it is by you or I?
Okay, and my second question is I would like each of you to pretend to have a White House press pass on. You are now sitting in the front row of the East Room where President Trump is about to walk in and conduct a press conference. You get to ask one question. He's going to call on you. It's guaranteed he's going to call on you. You get to ask one question. What is your question? Start over here.
Starting with me, wow. I mean, I think we can all recognize that the presidency and the office holds, I think for most of us, a special meaning, as we've seen politicians or influential people in our lives hold that office and influence change. And I think the question that I would ask the president is, I would want to know what kind of respect it is that he has for the office and how it is that he feels that he's upholding the legacy of the great men who have come before him and held that office.
I would ask the president why he feels it's necessary to use the type of rhetoric he does to get across his points. And I think this, and I would follow up with that, just saying, Mr. President, there are several hundreds of thousands of people who agree with your policy, but you're not articulating it in a way which it can be accessible to the entire American public. So I would wonder why, if you want to reach as many people as possible and convince as many people as possible, why you wouldn't use more inclusive rhetoric and rhetoric that ensures that everyone can understand you on both an intellectual level and on an empathetic level, so that we can all have civil discussions instead of just talking over each other and discussing inflammatory rhetoric.
Thank you.
Great job, you guys. Really terrific and a fascinating discussion. I wanted to ask about media consumption in general is going down. Journalism school attendance is on the decline. It doesn't seem like a real viable occupation for a lot of people coming up today. We see billionaires buying up media outlets, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, the list goes on and on. I wanted to ask your opinion, both of you, your opinion about whether or not that trend, a decline in interest in journalism, is the fault of the media? Did it do it to itself, or is the fault of us as the consumers? Is it shame on them or shame on us?
Well, if we look at the motivations of the media. As my opponent rightly points out, the media wants to make a profit. They want to ensure that people consume what they're putting out. And so the media has an interest in pandering to its audience. Because if the media does not publish information that's not appealing to the people who are going to consume that information, then it's going to go out of business. And so that's why I am led to believe that everything we're seeing in the press is not a symptom, but a response. Because the press, by its nature, has to make news and report news based on what people will consume. And so my opponent points out, we have polarized news. We have biased news. If the American people were demanding objective news right now, then that's what we would be seeing entirely. And so that's why I don't think the problem is the press. I don't think the problem is these journalists altogether. Of course, there are some journalists who are not reporting honestly. So what we're beginning to see is the American people are recognizing this. And they're saying, wait a minute, we need to slow down. We need to start talking to each other again. And so I think everything that we see in the media is representative of the political climate in America right now. And I think finally, people are starting to realize how crazy our discourse has gotten, how out of control it's gotten. And I think once our political climate starts to go back to normal and starts to be honest and fair, we're going to see the same thing happen in the press, which is why I don't think that the press itself and the freedoms guaranteed to the press are harmful. I just think we're in a very polarized political time, and as a result, we see a very polarized media.
Now, if the only question and the only issue or influence at play was media companies trying to get the most clicks or get the most views, then I might agree with my opponent's analysis. But what he overlooks is the fact that billionaires and special interest groups are not just trying to put out the news that will get the most clicks. They're trying to put out news and stories and ideas that will help them push their own agenda. And I don't know about you, but I personally don't really like being tried to be influenced or told what to do. I prefer to see the facts objectively and make my own decision. And I think the reason why so many people are turning away from the media and turning away from journalism is because the facts aren't being reported, and bias and an individual's interest has such a significant influence that people just don't want to watch it and people don't want to be told what to do. So if we take and we try and draw back the influence that those individuals have, then I think we'll see more people start turning towards the media, and we'll see more people sort of engaging in discourse and trying to be more informed.
Thank you for those. I have a second question, and it goes to the resolution. The resolution reads, on balance, the freedoms guaranteed to the press benefit American democracy. And a separate question for each. So, John, you brought up examples, international examples of the lack of freedom of press harming democracy. Can you give examples of contemporary U.S. examples where the freedom of press is benefiting democracy? And before you answer that, I wanted to ask you, Michael, on the other side of that same resolution question, you gave examples about how the freedoms are, I wanted to see if you could address how democracy is being harmed specifically. If is it lowering civic engagement, or is it lowering the voter turnout, or how specifically is it harming democracy other than having the big bad media out there? So if you can, both to your points, and if you can, starting with you, Michael, first.
Of course. So just to clarify the question, it's how can I cite specific negative impacts of the freedom of the press? Exactly. Perfect. So I think there's a couple of things. Right? I think that the more that we're told by the media that we consume that we should be thinking a certain way, the more that we're misled, the more that we start to lose that trust in media, right? The less we're going to want to participate in our government, the less we're going to want to participate in discussions, because the sort of factual middle ground, which is free of bias, where all of these debates and conversations live, where this debate lives, where this entire tournament, all these discussions that we've been having throughout this entire day live, is starting to disappear, and it's starting to erode. And so I would say that when we have freedoms of the press, which allow individuals to make it so that there's less of that middle ground, to make it so that they can push forward their own personal message, I think it makes all of us feel a lot more disenchanted with engaging with the news, engaging with politics, with politicians in general. And so I think we're seeing the problems that too many press freedoms are creating, that the rollback of Citizens United is increasing that type of influence, that as we're making the press more free and saying that individuals can print and distribute whatever ideas they want just because they have money, we're seeing a lot of people feel angry, upset, disenchanted, and a lot of the time that sometimes turns into voting for a populist, and other times that turns to people turning away from politics altogether. And both of those are incredibly distinct harms which we cannot have if we want to try and make sure that our democracy remains strong and free and really works for us in the years to come.
So I would say that the press currently, despite all of the bias, despite all of the dishonesty that we see in certain outlets, has still functioned as a truth teller, because even though there are instances of bias, we are still seeing investigative reporting. For example, whether or not you agree with President Trump, many of the things that he has done have been reported by the media. The truth is, a lot of those things are things that President Trump probably doesn't want us to know. And so the reality is, who exposed that information? The free press. And let's all think about this for a second. If President Trump could stop certain news stories from being published, or any president for that matter, which harmed their personal political career or their personal background, they would do so. It's intuitive. People are self-interested. And so let's put aside all of the bias for a second, all of the dishonesty that's coming out of some media outlets. It is undeniable that the media has exposed certain things that are going on in this administration that without them, we would have not known about. And so when we turn on the TV and we hear the bias and we hear all of these opinions, underneath that, we're still getting investigative reporting. And I'd also add that my opponent brings up this idea that the press has essentially gotten so nasty and so terrible that people are disengaging from the process. They no longer want to be a part of it. But I would say actually the opposite is happening, because people who watch the press, who are really interested in issues like all of us are, who really care about this country, they're saying this is unacceptable. We need to fix our discourse. We need to be having more conversations to counter this bias. So I would say that the current political climate and the bias that we're seeing right now is self-correcting. So just to wrap up, these are the two key points. One, despite the bias that currently exists now, the press still reports on matters that are important for the public to know. And two, that bias that I just mentioned will correct itself in the future. And we will ultimately see a press like we've seen in the past. And at the end of the day, despite its flaws, the press still does a great job of exposing what our public officials don't want us to know. Any further questions? Thank you very much. Is everybody ready? I'd like to start by providing a historical example. When the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed in Congress, it was passed 416 to 0 in the House of Representatives and 88 to 2 in the Senate. And at this point, the Pentagon Papers had not been published. We had no idea that this entire resolution had been based on a lie. This is what America looks like without the press. It wasn't until we finally got the Pentagon Papers released that we realized this resolution, which was passed nearly unanimously by our elected officials, was based on a lie. This is the America that would exist without the free press. Now, my opponent is going to try to convince you that he does not want to restrict the free press. He is not arguing that we should get rid of freedom of the press. Rather, we should just limit it to make our system work more effectively. But I'd remind you that every tyrannical government starts with small violations of liberty. You know, my opponent talked about the Founding Fathers and how the Founding Fathers were willing to make change in order to make the status quo better. But the Founding Fathers didn't make changes against the direction of liberty. They made changes in the direction of liberty. What's fundamentally different about America is that every time we make a change, we do it to make the people more free, not less. And so the idea that the Founding Fathers would be in support of even minor restrictions on one of our most fundamental freedoms is simply historically untrue. Now, my opponent has brought up a lot of important problems that exist currently with the media. But the reality is, these problems are not caused by the media. They are rather a response by the media. In reality, the media is just acting in a very poor political environment. And as we've seen in the past, when the political environment is much better than it is now, so is the press. The press is not the illness, it's just responding to the illness. So I'd ask all of you to think for a moment. Which America would you rather live in? Would you rather live in America where, sure, there's no polarization, there's no disagreement, but we all follow the one narrative provided by the government? We all listen to the story that our elected officials provide us with no oversight. Or would you rather live in an America where discourse is a little nasty? Yeah, some companies have a little more control, but we, the people, have the freedom to fight back. We, the people, have the ability to actually make change. No situation is perfect, and Ronald Reagan recognized this. But when we're faced with two choices, we should pick the choice that allows for more freedom, and we should pick the choice that allows for the most prosperity in America. Yes, there are problems with the press. Yes, there are problems with our current system. But even a small step towards restricting the press is a fundamentally un-American idea. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? Perfect. My opponent and I think everyone else here can all agree that there are some major problems with the press and with our democracy, that there is an illness, that we all shouldn't stand idly by and watch and and let it continue to fester and grow within our democracy and our country. My opponent says that I can't say the press will still exist because if we have any restrictions on the freedom of the press, because any small step restricting press freedom will inevitably lead towards authoritarianism. But I ask you, judges, and I ask the people in the audience to look to our neighbors in the Western world, like Canada, who have imposed restrictions on financial contributions in the press, or the UK, which has a major nationalized media company in the BBC. Neither one of these countries is on the path towards authoritarianism, and it is a false statement to say that if we restrict some freedoms, it will inevitably lead towards the collapse of all of them. The United States, before the Citizens United ruling passed, was not on the path towards authoritarianism. Reverting it to that state, which my opponent himself says was more politically balanced and less vitriolic, is something that's incredibly important and something that has value. If we both agree that the press is sick right now and that our country and our democracy is sick and it is going and trending downwards, then our press and the freedoms granted to the press are not benefiting our democracy. They're harming our democracy. And that's why it's so important that we take action to try and impose restrictions. Because saying that people need to act more responsibly or individuals shouldn't have a big say in elections isn't something that should be controversial. Thomas Jefferson, if you asked him, do you think that a billionaire should have control over the entire media narrative of hundreds of millions of people? He would say, no, absolutely not. And there's a certain element of common sense that we have to introduce here. And instead of looking to the past and being scared to blaze a new path towards the future, we have to recognize that the ills of our society have been caused by the alleviation and the increasing in the freedoms of the press and of individuals to do so. And that if we address those problems and we address those pieces of legislation, that our press and the underlying good, the core which our country was founded on, can start to work for us again. That we the people can take back our democracy from the hands of special interest groups. That we can make sure that the press reporting is less biased, that we can make sure that we're engaging on issues. My opponent also says that in response to bias, people are going to start to turn away, and that even sometimes people engage more as a result of bias. But I ask you to look around and ask yourself whether or not the engagement that we're seeing is something that is based in trying to understand the other side and reach across the aisle, or if it's something that's based in anger and hatred and vitriol. Because I think that if it's the latter, and I think we can all agree it's the latter, then we're seeing how the effects of this biased coverage can make it so that we turn against our fellow Americans and forget about what truly unites us. Thank you.
I want to congratulate you both on an amazing round and an incredibly intense and wonderful and rich discussion. So thank you to our debaters, to our audience. Right now, our judges are finishing up their ballots. They're writing some final comments and that sort of thing. And so I want to circle back to you, our audience, because you also get to cast a vote. So if you have your smartphone and you'd like to cast your vote, you can go to menti.com. We have the information right up there on the screen. And use the code 437035, and you can cast your vote. And so for the time being, I'm going to ask our national finalists to return to their seat in the audience for just a few minutes. And we'll give you a few minutes here to cast your votes. can assure you there's been no meddling with this election system. Okay, for those of you who have not yet seen, the polls are open. You can now cast your vote. It looks like folks are just about done casting their vote. And so as you wrap up casting your vote, before we announce our national champion, we have the distinct honor and privilege to welcome to the stage a speaker who understands a little bit about the complexity, the intensity, the pros and the cons of debating really important issues. Certainly someone who understands the need to understand both sides of an issue. It is my pleasure to invite to the stage for some remarks our head judge, Mr. Kami Akavan.
Oh, thank you, Tony, and thanks everybody for being here. Who here are parents? If you can, just raise your hand, parents. Got a lot of parents. That's great to see. Supporters who are here. You're not a parent, but you're here to cheer on the person you're here to support. That's great. A lot of supporters. I want to thank parents. I want to thank supporters. I want to thank the folks at the Reagan Library. Tony is a very humble guy, as you can tell, but Tony, you did a lot of work to pull this off. It was tremendous. Thank you so much for having us here today. Really appreciate it. Thank you to Rebecca. Thank you to Whitney. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Jeff. I didn't see you here tonight, but thank you. I know how hard it is to do these types of events. I want to say thanks as well to the ProCon staff who are here tonight. We have a nice crew from ProCon tonight, so thank you much. And to my 8-year-old son who got to watch this, thank you, Cameron, for coming tonight. All right. My biggest bravo, the biggest bravo I really want to give are to the debaters. And you saw some incredible examples of people who could think on their feet. Can you do that? I mean, can you believe what they just accomplished? It's so natural for them because they've had so much practice. But for those of us who are sitting and watching, with certainly me with my mouth open going, how do they do that? They really are tremendous debaters. And not just the folks that you saw here tonight, there was a lot of debaters that have been here and performing throughout the last few days who have risen through the ranks of a national debate competition. And so what I wanted to do right now, if I can, is ask the debaters who are here, and I'm going to call out Bryce, Sydney, when I call your name, if you can, just please stand. Bryce, Sydney, Camille, Audrey, Eli, Lorinda, Micah, Reagan, Aria, Eliora, John, Ben, the other Ben Lux, Michael, Gormley, Jackie, Tanner. Everybody, please join me in giving these guys a round of applause. Incredible. You guys are so impressive. Bravo, bravo. Bravo, thank you so much, thank you. One other thing I was curious about before I start on some prepared remarks is, we are here representing a nation of people, and I just wondered, for who is in the audience, how many people in this room are not here from California, outside of the state of California? It's a lot. Okay, that's terrific. How about anyone from outside of the contiguous 48 who are maybe from a territory, Alaska, Hawaii? Okay, how about Californians? Let's see Californians, raise your hands. Okay, a lot of Californians. Okay, excellent. That's really impressive. I mean, we have a great diversity of folks who are in this room today. This does not happen very often. The comments that I wanted to talk about today are how we have this great diversity of people, we have this great interest in debate, we have this great interest in supporting one another, and yet when we look at our national political scene, as our two debaters so eloquently described, we see a bit of a mess, right? And I just wanted to share a couple of examples of how big of a mess we're in. In 1950, there was a Pew Research poll that was done about whether a parent, and we saw how many parents were here, parents, would you object if your child married someone who is not of your political party? So in 1950, when asked this question, 5% of parents said, I would object. I do not want my child to marry someone opposite my political party. 5%. Same poll, flash forward 60 years, it's now the year 2010. Guess what percentage of parents said they would object if their kid married someone of the opposite political party? 45%. 45%. It's climbed a long ways, right? Share another statistic that I think is scary. We have 435 members of the House of Representatives, 100 members of the U.S. Senate. It's 535 federally competitive seats. This is where the magic of democracy is happening in the country. So of those 535 seats, there's a certain level of, I'm not sure who's going to win, because it's anybody's game, right? Some states, that's not so competitive. It's which Democrat is going to win or which Republican is going to win, but not which party is going to win. That's pretty predetermined. So I thought it's probably pretty blended throughout the country, where mostly in the country you're not sure if the Dems going to win, the Republicans going to win. It's a pretty even game. It's not an even game, folks. It is increasingly not an even game. It's to the point where we have same party voting that is so predictable that only 5% of our federally elected positions are considered, you're not sure who's going to win. So 5% out of these 535 seats, about 25, 30 seats, are where the magic of democracy is happening. The rest of it is pretty much predictable. So we look at these stats and think, that's awful. We are the world's example of democracy. This is supposed to be the engine for where we are spreading democracies and freedoms and opportunities throughout the world. Yet when we look in our own country and see this level of uncompetitiveness within our political system, we've got to wonder, what is going on? Why is this happening? And I asked a leading question earlier during the Q&A. I asked, who's to blame? Do we blame the media? Do we blame the money in politics? Do we blame politicians? Do we blame governments? Or do we blame ourselves? And I ask it as an open question, but I want to give you some information to think about. That information is about how we are sorting ourselves as people. We are. And I'll give you an example. There's a great book called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop. Tony, I know you know it well. So in The Big Sort, they give an example of a person who moves to Austin, Texas. And he's in Austin. It's the liberal city in conservative Texas, and he's trying to decide where to move in Austin. So he's driving around, and he sees driveways with trucks and gun racks. And this person's thinking, trucks, gun racks, no, that's not for me. I'm going to keep driving around. Goes to a different neighborhood. He sees Priuses in the driveway, and he's thinking, oh yeah, that's my neighborhood. I'm going to move to this community. And we all kind of do that when we're deciding where to live. Are you going where the gun racks are? Are you going where the Priuses are? We are self-sorting ourselves. That's one example. Another example, of course, is social media, of course. So we see that as these seats in our Congress have become less and less competitive, we have seen that the rise of social media has gone up and up and up. And so there are algorithms and there's sophisticated ways where if you like a speech by Hillary Clinton, guess what? Your friends are more likely going to see that speech. Or if you like a speech by Donald Trump, guess what? Your friends are more likely going to see that speech. And you're most likely going to see this stuff from your friends. And it just keeps echoing, 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 echoing. And what do we end up in? The echo chamber. And it ends up that this echo chamber is a really tall chamber where now we're exposed to contrary views where we're sitting around a Thanksgiving table, suddenly you see a relative from another part of the country, from another maybe economic class, different life experience, and they start saying stuff, and you wonder, how can you be saying this stuff? You are out of your mind. Oh, a Thanksgiving dinner breaks down fast, right? So this is not an infrequent experience for those of us living in the United States today. It's sad, but it's true, and we all have these kinds of examples. So what is the result of that? Well, like Michael brought up, what happens? We do shut down. What do they say? Don't talk about religion and politics, right? Don't talk about it. Well, how are we going to make a democracy function if we just don't talk about the issues? Of course we have to talk about it. We have to do the opposite. That is the worst advice. You have to talk about politics. We have to talk about issues. We have to. That is how democracies thrive. So I'm giving you all the gloom and doom and bad news first, because I like to start with the con. And that is a huge con, right? So what are we going to do, guys? What are we going to do to make it to where we don't have to live in that kind of climate anymore? And I think you saw a huge example of, and a great example of what we're going to do. We're going to debate. We're going to debate because that is the vehicle that we know is going to work for a lot of people. So let me set this up and tell you a little bit about my organization and me. So my name is Kami, right? There's not a lot of commies where I grew up in South Louisiana. It was considered an insult, not a first name, but that's my real first name. And obviously I stood out there, moved to California, and remember the most common last name in the phone book of Opelousas, Louisiana was Sachery. Was after Sachery? It's Cormier. And then what else? Thibodeau's. Those kind of names. Moved to Los Angeles. Then what? It's Gomez. It's Gonzalez. It's very different life experience. Now, if you take a Thibodeau and you put him in Los Angeles, surrounded by Gonzalez, they think, I don't know what's going on. This is a different kind of America. Vice versa, you take a Gonzalez and you put him in South Louisiana, talk to the Thibodeaus, they think, wow, what a different country than I experienced. That's fantastic. We want that kind of cross-pollination. We want people to be exposed to different points of view, to different kinds of people. Exposure is debate. Exposing people to views that they don't necessarily hold because they just didn't even know this was out there because they've just been looking up in their silo and all they're hearing is what their friends think, what their parents think, what their social media feeds are telling them. Exposure is key. So ProCon is primarily a digital resource. Our primary goal is to take people who will not talk to each other and force them to talk to each other because we're going to put them literally side by side, pro and the con. It's not our idea. It was Ben Franklin's idea. Ben Franklin's buddy was trying to decide whether or not to get married to his own cousin. That's beside the point. So he said, take a sheet of paper, fold it in half, go through this process called moral algebra. You write all your arguments for on one side of the sheet of paper, all your arguments against on the other side, and use this moral algebra to figure out where you stand. Well, his friend tried it, and guess what? He did not marry his own cousin. Hooray, it works. So the first example, right? And it's the Founding Fathers concept, and it's a great concept, and all ProCon has done is taken that and brought it to the digital age. So the concept is extremely simple. Pro and con, side by side. But guess what? That does not happen in our lives. So we are using this digital platform to the other side and go, maybe I'm not so pro-death penalty. Maybe I'm kind of pro-death penalty, and I acknowledge that there's some merit on these arguments. That's wonderful. That's how we turn down the rhetoric. That's how we do what Archbishop Desmond Tutu said his father always told him. He said, don't raise your voice, improve your argument. Yes, that's what we want. So ProCon has served, Tony said, 25 million readers a year. That's 180 million people since we started. This was back in 2004. We found that when exposed to a different point of view, guess how many people changed their mind on an issue? I told our staff, if we get to 5% of people changing their minds, high fives all around, pizza for lunch. We got to 36%. I think I owe a nice meal for that, right? 36% of people at ProCon are changing their minds on issues just based on being exposed to a point of view they hadn't known about before. I think that you cannot do that with a weapon, and here we are doing it with information. That says a lot about the power of debate. Exposure is key. So I want to also share about the difficulty of having these conversations where those Thanksgiving meals break down. I'll tell you an example. We had a person named Felipe, and Jeannie, you know the story about Felipe, right? So Felipe's mother has glaucoma. He lives in central Missouri. And in central Missouri, his mom had tried all kind of things to help her glaucoma. She didn't know what to do. Felipe thought, oh, I hear out in California, if you use marijuana, it's actually going to help with glaucoma. So he calls up ProCon. We have medical marijuana as one of our sites. He says, should we move to California because my mom has glaucoma? I think, wow, you know, you really ought to talk to your physician about this. This is a major life decision. You ought to consult with others. I go, however, do all that stuff, of course, but by the way, we have asked all the ophthalmological groups, we've asked all the glaucoma organizations, and you can see their statements and their positions on whether or not it's a useful treatment for glaucoma. So he did. He read both sides and said, called me 2 days later, and he said, we're going to stay right here in Missouri. We're doing just fine. We're not going to move to California to try this new funny medicine. So they did, and he made a major life decision based on exposure because he couldn't have that conversation, or he felt like he couldn't, in his own community. So they type it into Google, medical marijuana, glaucoma, and he finds this organization and thinks, I mean, how desperate do you have to be to think, I'm going to call this random thing I just found on Google because I can't find the answer? A lot of us feel that desperation. Like, we want information, we really do, but we don't know where to go to get it. Go to ProCon. Expose yourself to different points of view. Use the power of debate. We did not make up this concept. Who's the greatest champions of debate? The Greeks. They invented democracy. What do? They debate. Why did they debate? They didn't have printing presses to democratize education. If you wanted to print a Bible when the Greeks were forming democracy, you had to write it by hand, and one scribe would take 5 years for one Bible. Guess what? A lot of people are going to see that Bible. But you could go into a public square, you could hear people debating, you could get information pro and con, and come to your own conclusions. That was the way to democratize education. It was with debate. And that brings me to what I wanted to mention here broadly about debate. In debate, there are really no winners and losers. Yes, we have to select a better debater today, but all of us have won by hearing this debate. We've all learned so much. We've all challenged ourselves. We've all come to more informed perspectives, sharpened our opinions, because there's no losers in debate. We all win when there's a good debate. The goal of debate is to enlighten, to stoke critical thinking, to use our ethos and logos and pathos so that the debaters and the audience can see the range of opinion artfully, respectfully, passionately, compellingly expressed. And when we walk away, we all benefit. Debate benefits us all. But debate is conflict. There's no question, and conflict is uncomfortable. But guess what? Learning is uncomfortable. That's how it works. It's okay to be uncomfortable. Debate is partially about speech and delivery, and boy, you folks are tremendous at speech and your verbal delivery, no question. But one of the other things that debate does, it is useful at sharpening these perspectives. It teaches us empathy. What do you have to do? You have to listen to your opponent's arguments so that you can account for them and adjust for them. Listening is a forgotten skill, but it's a key part of debate. Showing respect for opposing views. There was no harsh words exchanged. There was lots of civility. They were modeling civil discourse. If we had more of that on a federal level, wouldn't y'all be happier for that? I sure would. Stimulating critical thinking on any issue for which there's competing views. So, we're sitting here under this ginormous airplane that has held a president that's flown over 600,000 miles in that plane. This is a rare opportunity for all of us, myself included, and certainly for Cameron, right, where we get to do this. And I want to think about Ronald Reagan specifically because we're here. Ronald Reagan had bitter political foes. There's a lot of people who think he was not our greatest president, and they have fought with him tooth and nail while he was in office. One of those people was the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill coming from the Democrat side, Ronald Reagan, obviously the Republican, and they didn't always get along. And they called each other some really terrible things at times, especially Tip. Tip was particularly colorful in his outrage with President Reagan. But you know what? As much as they could not tolerate each other's politics, you know what they would do? They would get together for drinks on a regular basis without their aides, without people from the other political party. They would get together and they would just talk it out one-on-one, person to person, human being to human being, and they would say, you know what, I'm going to back down off of this issue, you back down off of that, we'll come up with some kind of compromise, because they were putting country over party, and they're putting their politics aside for the sake of progress, the common good. And that behavior is one that we should celebrate. Sure, they called each other all kind of stuff. Their politics were divisive, but they still got along as people, and that's what we need to do. We need to get along as people. Reagan championed then that, not just at the national level, but he did it with the Soviet Union, their famous friendship with Gorbachev, right? This is the type of civil discourse that we would like to model in the country, and that we think debate facilitates. So that said, to the debaters, to the Reagan Library staff, to the parents, to the people who came out here to support the debaters, you don't need to be reminded about the importance of debate. You get it. Exposing yourself to different views, that's the only way to do what, was it Ice Cube? Check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? We need that counterpoint. We need it. It's essential. And we quoted Archbishop Desmond Tutu, but let me give you another quote. This is Joseph Joubert. This is a French philosopher talking at the time when the French were the American allies, when we were opposed to the British during the Revolutionary War. And at the time, this philosopher said, it is better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it. So with that, I'll say let's all improve our arguments, sharpen our perspective, respect one another for what we have in common, and always remember there are no losers in debate. We all win. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Kami. At this time, I'm going to invite our other final round judges to the stage. And we are going to, before we announce our national champion, sorry, gentlemen, but we're going to recognize all those other debaters. So if I could have our other final round judges come up on stage. All right, so as Kami pointed out, there are no losers. So we're going to start off. Every national finalist receives at least some scholarship money as a result of qualifying for this competition. So congratulations to the following debaters for being Great Communicator National qualifiers, who will receive a $1,500 scholarship each. So this first debater is a graduate of Lorena High School, where she was passionate about being a leader in various extracurricular activities. She also loves singing. Laura Svoboda will be attending UC Berkeley in the fall, double majoring in microbial biology and environmental economics and policy on the pre-law track. So congratulations, Laura. Our next student is a rising senior at Tall Oaks Classical School in Wilmington, Delaware. Micah Pope, come on up to the stage. Micah enjoys tinkering with computers and playing the electric guitar. He also runs cross country and is working as a lifeguard this summer. So congratulations, Micah. Thank you, Micah. Next up is Audrey Snodgrass. Audrey, come on down. A rising junior at the Collegiate School of Medicine and Bioscience in St. Louis, Missouri, Audrey participates in debate, student council, and National Honor Society, as well as in various sports. Audrey is interested in constitutional law and politics. Congratulations to you, Audrey. Next up is Elijah Rojas. This recent graduate of Truman High School in Independence, Missouri, will be attending the Henry W. Block School of Management at the University of Missouri, Kansas City this fall. Elijah founded the Amicus Rose LLC, a financial firm providing free financial education to anyone interested in learning how to break from the cycle of poverty. Congratulations, Elijah. Next up, Camille Scholes. Camille is a rising senior at Collegiate School of Medicine and Bioscience in St. Louis, Missouri. She plays the piano and treated us to a wonderful concert last night and composes her own pieces. In college, she wants to major in political science with a minor in either public policy or social justice. Congratulations, Camille. Our next honoree is a graduate of West Shore Christian Academy, Reagan Werner. As you can imagine, we're a fan of the name Reagan around this place. She's from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and plans on attending Franklin and Marshall College next year to study pre-law. A fun fact about Reagan is that during her free time, she memorized the entire Psych TV series. So if your Wi-Fi connection's down, you need to binge watch. Congratulations. Next up is Aria Bright. Aria is a rising senior at El Camino Real Charter High School and intends to major in actuarial sciences. Aria enjoys learning foreign languages, including Hebrew and Spanish, in his free time. Next up is Lorinda Ruse. Lorinda is a recent graduate of Truman High School in Independence, Missouri, and has already transitioned into her collegiate journey. She currently attends classes at Georgetown University for summer and will return in the fall to study international politics. Congratulations, Lorinda. Excellent. Now we are going to move on and honor our national quarterfinalists. Each of our national quarterfinalists will be awarded a $2,500 scholarship. So first up, Ben Goldberg. A recent graduate of Half Hollow Hills High School in East in Long Island, New York, he will be attending the George Washington University in the fall. Ben plans on majoring in political science and is in the college's honor program. In his free time, he enjoys debating and binge watching on Netflix. Next up is Tanner Jones. Tanner just graduated from Edina High School in Edina, Minnesota, with plans to attend Dartmouth College in the fall. Tanner looks to study philosophy and foreign policy. Tanner loves Major League Baseball and very specifically, the Minnesota Twins. Go Twins. So congratulations, Tanner. Next up is Sydney Stogel. Sydney is a rising senior at Hendrickson High School in Pflugerville, Texas, and will graduate in 2019 and hopes to major in philosophy and become a prosecutor. So congratulations, Sydney. Also a rising senior from Hendrickson High School, Bryce Hahn. After his senior year, Bryce plans to go to A&M. When not debating, he is captain of his school's ultimate Frisbee team. So congratulations, Bryce. Next up, our semifinalists. Each of our 2018 semifinalists will take home a $5,000 scholarship. Our first semifinalist is Jackie Wei. Jackie's a rising senior at Plano West Senior High School in Plano, Texas. She has a terrible habit of not finishing TV shows, and the only two TV shows she has finished to the very end are Downton Abbey and Sherlock. So congratulations. Our second semifinalist is Ben Lux. Ben is a rising senior at Hearts of Mary Home Educated in Denton, Texas. Plans on majoring in pre-med chemistry or biology. He was on the hit TV show Barney and Friends as a kid. And now for the rest of the night, you won't be able to get that song out of your head. Excellent. And now I want to invite our two finalists to the stage for the announcement. As you all know, it was a spirited debate. It was a tough call. In a very close vote, so a final vote of 3-2, our national runner-up from New York City, which doesn't narrow it down, our runner-up is Michael Gormley. Congratulations, Michael. And what that means is that our returning and defending national champion, back for a second time, also from New York City, Mr. John Michael McGlure. Congratulations. So with that, I'm going to invite all of our national finalists. I think we're going to take a picture here on stage, right? Or we're going to take it over here by the mural. Oh, we're going to take one with our two. Yeah. And while we are taking these photographs, we're going to invite the rest of you to start joining us down at dinner. We've got dinner right behind you there. Thank you all for attending the 2018 National Championship for the Great Communicator Debate. Have a wonderful rest of your